Good afternoon, everybody. It's Neil here from the Public Relations Institute of Australia. Thanks everybody for tuning in to today's webinar, which is the Golden Target Awards 2015 and how to write a winning entry. Julian, our normal maestro behind the webinar mic, is just overseas at the moment, so you're stuck with me today. And I also have Jonathan from our office, who's our events manager as well. So we're going to hang on the line for the duration of the webinar if there's any queries that we can help with. But our facilitator today is Grant Smith. Now, Grant has come on board as co-chair of the 2015 Golden Target Awards Executive Committee, along with Angela Coombs. Angela is just in transit at the moment, so she's not going to be joining us today. So Grant is going to be driving the session. Hopefully we'll have it wrapped up pretty quickly. I don't think it's going to last a full hour. So we'll do our best to kind of get everything out there and get you on your way and so you can head into the weekend. In terms of just some small details, if you've got any questions, you can use the question tool on the right-hand side of your toolbox there. Jonathan and I will monitor them as we go through, and as best we can, we'll try and get Grant to answer them as we go along. Now, just to introduce Grant, Grant Smith is now principal at Smith Communications. He's worked at Edelman for 5 years, where he worked to develop a culture of performance focused on delivering tangible business metrics for his clients. Beyond media coverage and awareness, he's generated the sorts of results that matter to clients' businesses. In 2014, this saw Edelman in Melbourne awarded 2 PRA Golden Target Awards in the B2B category. So there's no better person really to be here today to kind of spearhead the webinar. Grant has judged the GTAs, he's won awards at GTAs, and now he's on our executive committee. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Grant, who's now going to just share his screen, and we're going to start the webinar.
Great, thanks Neil.
Okay, over to you, Grant.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you everyone for taking the time out to join us. I was in the same position as many of you about this time last year, so I know that lunchtime on a Friday is not the best time to be sitting here learning how to fill in forms. So we want to make this as useful as possible for you in the time that you've put aside to be able to listen. Rather than take you through a step-by-step process presentation today, what I thought would be more helpful would be to give you some guidance on how to review some past award submissions and what to look for in the case studies that are available on the PRA website so that you're able to shape your own entry development locally and so that you're able to interrogate the quality of your own entry prior to submitting. So Neil's going to talk through quite a lot of the process piece towards the back end of this session, and what I wanted to do at the start was give you a little bit of guidance from a judge's perspective into what sort of things are going to push the right buttons and how you can sit down and actually frame your entry right from the outset. As Neil mentioned, my co-chair this year is Angela, who's unable to be with us today, so you'll be stuck with the dulcet tones of my nasal striny twang for the best part of the session. So we're looking at a very different awards landscape for the 2015 GTAs. There have been numerous new categories included, and you're going to hear quite a lot about the category piece as we go through this session, because category selection is one of the critical determinants of how successful your particular entry is going to be. I thought right from the start it would be useful to go back and have a look at some lessons from things that have worked well in the past. Obviously, one of the things that we do want to strive for every year with the Golden Targets is to look for new ways of thinking about similar challenges to what we've faced in the past, but using new technologies, new opportunities, new relationships to be able to drive success with our organizational stakeholders if we're an in-house if we're in an in-house capacity, and from an agency perspective, obviously working to deliver clients' business objectives. So going back to some of the things that have worked over the last 39 years, I'd really suggest mining through the 2014 case studies on the website And I've called out 3 here to have a specific look at because the 3 of these all reflect some common themes in the way that they've been produced. They're all slightly different in style, so you'll be able to see that you don't necessarily have to follow a secret template or anything like that to be able to do this well. But the things that are common between all of them are some of the reasons that these particular cases did as well as they did last year. And in full disclosure, there is one of the Edelman case studies on here purely as a point of reference, but as Neil said, we were fortunate enough to be awarded golden targets for 2 pieces of work, both in the B2B category, and both of those are actually quite different pieces of work as well. So I'll talk a little bit about how you can make sure that your entry stands out in the category that you do select as we get into that part of the session. The thing I would constantly encourage you to do is make reading your entry an experience a judge is going to enjoy. So depending on the category that you're entering, judges may be looking at 20 or 30 competing submissions, and they've got to go through all of them against the criteria that are in the entry kit. So the easier you can make it for a judge to see the quality of your work stacked up against the criteria for your category, the more fulfilling the experience will be for them, because they'll be able to look at this and say, this is someone who's taken the time to communicate what they're trying to convey as simply and in as straightforward a way as possible. And that right from the outset gives you an advantage, because not every entry that goes in for each category is well presented or is well ordered or is well organized. From personal experience, having looked at quite a few of these in the past, there is a real challenge that entrants need to overcome, which is actually creating a linear narrative that works through the planning methodology that communications practitioners actually follow. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. But the case studies that I'd recommend that you look at are the Successfully Navigating Troubled Waters case study from the Issues and Crisis category. This is a great example of a team that was able to challenge a brief from a client in a way that shaped the objectives that they were being asked to deliver against. And by reshaping and reframing those objectives, they were able to do the research that was required to help develop a strategy that was going to inform the successful attainment of those objectives. The second is from the pro bono category, and it was from Pestle and Carr, and this is a great piece of work for anyone who does live in Victoria. You may have actually seen this firsthand, and it's titled Her Name Was Tracy and She Was Loved. One of the things that really stands out about this entry is the simplicity of the process that goes from objectives to strategy. And if you can help your judges see that there is actually a logic pathway from setting the objectives to informing the research you need to do into target audiences and identifying for yourself the strategy that's most likely to be successful, then you're going a really long way to showing that you understand the planning methodology that needs to go into a successful campaign. And so award entries are not about getting amazing results, they're about getting relevant results, which brings me to the Fonterra Proud to be a Chef entry, which was not in empirical terms a wonderful example of how to get your story out there in the media. It was a very good example of being able to deliver on the client's requirements for the piece of work. And by having that linear narrative that goes from objectives all the way through to results, by making it really easy for the judge to follow the thought process that you went through in shaping the campaign, and by tying the results back to the objectives that you set right at the outset, you're setting yourself up for the greatest possible success in the categories that you enter. So, as I said, rather than copying past entries, and you know, the PRAA has worked with a number of different entry mechanics over time, so it's not necessarily feasible to expect you'll get a standardized format over the last 10 years. There are some consistent things that do stand out over time. And if we look at the 3 that I just referred to on the previous slide, the first is that you need to work really hard right at the outset to match your entry to the category criteria. What I mean by that is look at the criteria that each category you might conceivably look at states and try and understand which of those criteria are going to be best served by the work that you've done previously. So if I look at the two Edelman entries from last year in the B2B category, one was for Fonterra, the other was for GE Capital. Now GE Capital was a B2B brief right at the outset. It was designed to generate leads for a finance organization from the mid-market, so companies of a particular size that were likely to need to borrow money at some point in the future. So it's definitely a B2B marketing conversation. The Fonterra example for us though was really challenging because this is Fonterra's biggest piece of brand communication that goes to market that has the word Fonterra on it. So you might buy Ski Yoga or you might buy Mainland Cheese, but you never really think about the parent brand behind those. So from a Fonterra perspective, there is a big consumer profiling piece of work that comes from Proud to be a Chef. But when we look at the objectives for what we were actually tasked to deliver in the terms of business results for Fonterra, it was about putting the brand into kitchens around the country. And so when you look through the case study, you'll see that we've focused much more on lead generation and relationship development and entry numbers, and that all of those results tied into the objectives and the strategy that were developed at the outset. So do spend some time interrogating the different categories of award that you might enter and work right from the start towards writing an entry that responds specifically to the criteria as they're laid out. And by following that path, what you're starting to do is apply the discipline to keep the information that's relevant for the awards and bin the information that you might personally be attached to but doesn't actually contribute to the winning of the golden target for that specific category. As I said, you really do need to have a linear logic from objectives all the way through to results, and that needs to really be a narrative that flows through the entire entry. So at every stage, you should be able to link your first section to your second section to your third section with the words so. So if you say, these were our objectives, so we then did some research to identify X, Y, Z, and as a result of that research, we're able to say, this is the strategy that we need to develop. I know this sounds really 101, and there's probably nothing I'm telling you that you didn't hear in the first week of your comms degree back when you were in university, but having been a judge and a category coordinator, I can tell you that about 15% of entries actually represent themselves in this way. And there is a really high correlation between the entries that follow a linear narrative and the ones that score a lot of points and go on to get certificates and trophies at the end of the year. The third thing I really wanted to highlight in this conversation today is it's really important for you to have a deep understanding of why you did whatever it was that you did. And if I look at the Fonterra example again, this was a property that had existed for 11 years before Edelman even started working with the Fonterra business, and we were asked to do something with an existing property. That's a really important consideration, particularly for agency people who are entering awards. If a client brings a piece of IP or something that they've already invested significant capital in over time and says, what can you do with this? One of the challenges you have to overcome is that you're not starting at the outset of objectives. You're not starting with a white sheet of paper. You're starting with constraints, and you need to do the best job that you can within those constraints. Similarly, if you're in-house, you're going to have a series of internal stakeholders who have all got a vested interest in the work as well, and you're going to have to operate within the restrictions that exist for you. So what you really need to understand is if I'm doing a thing, if we did a thing 10 months ago when we actually did the work, why did we do that specific thing? And you need to frame your entry in such a way that a judge who's hearing about this for the first time can agree that what you did was the right thing at the time. So if a client comes to you and says, we want you to help us manage the media so that people don't hear about the way we treat our staff, then if you go ahead and do that, you're going to need to frame your entry in such a way as to highlight why doing that exact thing is the thing that you should have done. Whereas if you look back to the Navigating Troubled Waters case study, you'll see that the agency actually had a conversation with the client about reframing the objectives and changing the narrative around what their expectations were. And by doing that, they were able to then produce a suite of results that were aligned to the objectives as they evolved to be. So having a really clear understanding of the why may not necessarily make it into the document that you submit, but it will help you frame the document that you write in order to ensure it looks like you are doing the right thing. If you can't show that your campaign has specifically delivered a result that aligns to objectives, I would strongly urge you to think hard about spending $350 entering the awards. And Neil, after this, will probably try and shoot me. But the reality is, if you're submitting something because you're having a go, you're probably not going to win. So you really need to dissect the piece of work that you're thinking about entering and be really critical and challenge yourself and challenge your teams and say, if we want to win with this piece of work, what are the things that we need to deliver on that are going to give us the best possible chance of doing that? This isn't primary school sport. There's no coach's award. This is about results, and this is about recognizing and rewarding the best in-class work in all of the categories that we have. So we want to make sure that we're showcasing the work that is done to the highest possible standard and that delivers the best possible outcome against the brief that the entrants faced. If I had to distill what makes an award-winning campaign into a single sentence, it would be the work delivers on a promise. And really there are three keywords in here. The first is work. You actually have to show that some work was done, and that requires several stages of technical work and several stages of intellectual work. You actually have to go to the trouble of framing your objectives as being smart. They have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they've got to be achievable, they've got to be realistic, they've got to be time constrained in some way. So you've got to do some work in making sure that your objectives are actually framed that way. It's not enough to say our client wanted to raise awareness of their brand through media coverage. You have to have an understanding of why that's a viable objective. You've got to have a time frame in which that's going to happen. What sort of media coverage is going to be relevant for the client? What research do you have that actually shows a correlation between brand awareness and media coverage? It doesn't have to be war and peace. It only needs to be enough to show that you're thinking about the way your objectives are framed. Delivery is really key. In the interest of disclosure, once was beaten in inverted commas in a category by a piece of work that objectively didn't achieve its objectives, but it was a much better organized campaign entry than the one that we had. But the promise of the entry that won that year was actually delivered on. And so you really need to understand what's the premise that the work is being undertaken on. What was the reason for going to the trouble of putting all of this work into field? What was the reason for spending the money? What was the reason for the client picking up the phone and calling you? What was the reason that you turned up to work every day for 6 months to work on this campaign? That delivery is really around the results that actually matter. And you know, if I go back to some of the campaigns I saw last year, there were a lot of campaigns that talked about the media coverage that were achieved, but they were about stakeholder engagement, and the stakeholders weren't meant to be reached through media coverage. They were meant to be reached through online vehicles. So if you spend 150 words of your 1,000-word limit talking about media coverage, you're burning copy. There's no relevance to it. So you've really got to focus on what's the delivery in this entry. What was the thing that was delivered by this piece of work? And the third thing is the promise. And the promise is really around understanding what are the objectives that the piece of work does need to deliver against and why are they important. And if you can answer those questions for yourself, then it makes it easier to frame your entry, and the easier it is for you to get that kind of structural piece done right at the outset, the more straightforward the writing of the rest of it will become, because you're already limiting yourself in terms of how much of the guff that you could put in actually needs to go in. So the results need to meet or exceed the objectives. And in the example where my team didn't win a number of years ago, the challenge in that scenario was the objectives were unrealistic and not smart. But you don't have to get all the points in the category, you only have to get the most to win. So if you can show that the objectives are framed in a realistic and achievable way, then whatever results you did achieve should reflect a realistic expectation at the end of the campaign. The strategy that you articulate in your entry needs to be grounded in key insights, and those need to be derived from specific research. Insight is one of those words that everyone in marketing services and consulting uses, and it has a different meaning for everyone. So you really need to understand what were the kind of eureka or aha moments from the research that you did that shaped the way you develop the strategy and the different parts of the strategy. So to me, I look at an insight as being what happens when you combine any two facts and come up with a new piece of information that you can exploit. If I think about the Fonterra example, we know from a wealth of primary and secondary research that people aged 16 to 19 do spend a lot of time online. Okay, that's great. That's not an insight, that's a fact. We also know that when you're working a 12-hour shift in a kitchen, you're not on a smartphone, you're playing with knives, you're washing dishes, you're in an environment that's incredibly hostile towards Facebook. So we know that the target audience for a part of the Fonterra campaign isn't going to be reached at work via a mobile device. So we have to think differently about how we're going to reach into that particular audience. Is the workplace the best place to reach them? Is their home environment the best place to reach them, or is there somewhere else that we need to reach them? And if you go back through that Fonterra case study, you'll see that there's actually a multi-layered strategy for reaching potential entrants in a competition through multiple channels at different times of day from different sources of influence who are all telling a different version of the same story, which is get yourself an entry form and sign up. The evaluation mechanic is really, really critical for success in the golden targets, because if you are not using an approved evaluation mechanic, then you're not going to get any score for the evaluation section of your submission. And in a tightly fought category, that's going to be problematic. The Barcelona principles are a good place to start. The PRA website's a good place to start. I know, again, from personal experience, some multinational organizations do consider advertising value equivalent to be the metric that they are going to use for evaluation. And that's fine because you need your client to pay your bills. However, if you want to enter that piece of work in the golden targets, you need to have a really frank conversation with your client or with your internal stakeholder around what are the evaluation metrics that we're going to be able to use instead of AVE. Because assuming a 300% ROI for a piece of media coverage over an ad of equivalent size isn't going to cut it. And if you do all of the rest of the work and still refer to AVE as part of your evaluation, then you're really wasting a lot of your own time in doing that. And I know this is a conversation that comes up every year, but the reason it comes up every year is because every year someone puts it in. The final point around innovation, and I touched on this before, innovation rewards relevance and effectiveness. It's not a kind of elephant stamp for picking up on something that's trendy. If Snapchat, for example, is the right channel for you to do something that's never been done before, but you're going to reach your audience in a meaningful way and you're going to be able to measure the impact of having done that. Fantastic. Use Snapchat and make sure it's really clear in your entry that you're clever enough to do that. Similarly for other mobile platforms or apps, so things like Tinder, or if you go out, and God knows how anyone would ever use Tinder to achieve anything commercial, but if you've got one, please enter it because I'm curious. If you're building an app, if you're building a website, all of those things are great, and we all know that the internet's a wonderful thing, but if you're doing stuff with content because you were on a webinar 6 months ago that said content is king and everyone should be selling content marketing, and we're all about content, and it's not relevant, but it's sexy, it's not going to get the kind of points you want. And that's a conversation that will be had over and over again with category coordinators and judges between now and the time that the awards are finalized, because we need to make sure that as an industry we're propagating the best practice work across the entire spectrum of what it is that PR people do. So if there are lots of content marketing entries this year, that will be wonderful, but our really sincere hope is that there is a strategic rationale for why a particular type of content was used or why a particular digital channel was used. So we've really got to make sure that relevance and effectiveness are the things informing the way we think about the new stuff, and that we're not just jumping on the bandwagon and saying, hey, here's a new thing, let's use that. You know, let's use WhatsApp because everyone was talking about it and oh, it's edgy. Similarly, if it's using social media for a client that hasn't been in social media before, that in itself is not particularly interesting because lots of organizations use social media. So you need to think about, again, if it's an innovation story that you're trying to tell as part of your award submission, what's the innovative part? You know, if you had to lobby for 5 years to get a company to build a Facebook page, you'd want to have a really good reason for why Facebook's important for them. Cool. So some more tips because everyone loves a tip. We had a conversation with one entrant a couple of days ago who was asking around category selection. And I think having been in the boat of chopping and changing right up until the last minute that we actually hit send on the credit card details last year, I think this is a really important piece of thinking for you to do before you get too far down the rabbit hole. So regardless of the category that you're entering your award into, the things that are going to help you succeed are applicable for every category. So first of all, get a copy of the entry kit, read it thoroughly, and pick your category on the basis of where does the work fit best, not what's the category that's going to look the sexiest if I've got that certificate up in the lobby when people come into the office. I've had this very conversation on several occasions with clients that were doing community type campaigns where we were building social networks for them, and they didn't want to be in the community relations space because they didn't for themselves see their work as being in community relations, and it would have created problems for them within their own organization if they were seen to be claiming that territory. So rather than create a problem for the client, we had to choose to not enter the work despite the fact it was a community relations initiative at the time. Now, had we been doing that work now, we'd have digital categories that we could have looked at and it would be a different type of conversation. But you need to make sure you're setting yourself up for success by putting your work with the category that's going to reward it the most highly. You need to make sure you include your budget. I've always worried about this from an agency perspective. I've always felt a little bit peculiar about doing it. So I want to be really clear that the way a judge looks at the budget that you include is, are you being transparent about the scale of work required to deliver the results that you delivered against? You don't get penalized if your budget's big, small, or in the middle. there are categories for big and small, and that's fantastic for anyone who's fortunate enough to get those, hundreds and thousands of dollars for individual campaigns or projects. That's great. But what we want to make sure no one is feeling is that there's any kind of recognition that cheap work is better than expensive work. That's absolutely not the case. If you're, particularly from an agency perspective, if you're feeling as though your work's not going to cut it in a particular category, unless it's the pro bono or low budget category, because it was really expensive, that's fine. How well did you use the money that you were given to do the work that you needed to do? The other thing I'd really remind you to keep at the front of your mind is the market is full of great work, which is why there are so many awards programs. There's the Golden Targets, there's Umbrella, there's BNT, there's AdNews. Everyone's got an award of some sort, and therefore there is going to be a lot of competition. And the thing that you need to remember is the award can only be given on the basis of the data that's put in front of the judge. So your entry needs to represent your work in the best possible light. I've personally felt the sting of not having done that as well as I needed to in order for the work to be recognised in the way that we thought it deserved to be. That's on me because I wrote that entry. Similarly, the person who writes your entry actually has to be a good, competent writer. They need to be able to write to task. They need to be able to condense the amount of words they use to tell their story. You've got to make the entry as representative as possible of the quality of the work that you did. And so some years, yes, campaigns will win, even though there might have been more meaningful work done in the market or more impactful work done for a particular client, but the judges can only evaluate the information you put in front of them. So if the information's badly ordered, if it doesn't have a linear logic to it from objectives through to results, if you can't see a natural transition from objectives to research to insights to strategy to tactics to execution to evaluation, all of those things are going to make it harder for your work to be recognised for being the great work that it is. So do your research, ask questions, come to the PRA, talk to winners from previous years if you know them, and if you don't know them, come to the PRA and see if someone can arrange an introduction for you. Rework your entry a number of times. Often say it's easier to edit than it is to create. So, you throw out your first pancake, throw out your first entry version, rewrite it until it's really schmick and you've got the critical data as the focus of the work that you're submitting on the day that you actually upload it.
I might jump in there, Grant, because we've just got two quick questions. The very first one is from Sean. Sean says, just in relation to the budget element of an entry, if you're part of an in-house team, do staff wages need to be included?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I would say from a personal perspective, no, because staff within an in-house team are assets of the organisation, and the organisation would be carrying those costs, in theory, regardless of the work that you're entering into this particular campaign. You could put a cost, a fee equivalent estimate of, we've got 3 people and 2 of them were 40% dedicated and another one was 60% dedicated to this piece of work, and the approximate staff cost for that was $100,000. But it really, I think, is going to come back to more what was the budget for the piece of work that you did. So if you didn't spend any money externally, if you did it all in-house, then you're going to need to come up with some kind of head hours assessment, but that I wouldn't think would be overly difficult or beyond the capability of a quick conversation with someone in your finance or HR department to say, look, I don't need to know how much people get paid, but it would be great if you can give me an estimate on what would be the hourly spend for this combination of people.
Cool. Thanks for that. And just one final question from Naomi. One of her campaigns, the client has requested that they keep the budget confidential, brackets, in relation to public affairs crisis comms activity, close brackets. Do you see this as being a problem?
Yeah.
Yeah, are you still there? Are you still there, Grant? Okay, I think we might have just lost Grant for the moment. So just speak on in, Grant, if you do tune back in. What I'll do is I can just go through the next few slides while we just wait for Grant to come back. So we were just up to look, Naomi, on that question. I don't think it's going to be a problem, because with the budgets, although it is part of the entry process, the budgets are kept very confidential. So they're only really reviewed by the judges in that category. So if your award was to go on and receive any kind of recognition, the budgets are never actually shown publicly. So it's kept. Yep. Yeah, so the budgets are kept very confidential. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. No, I mean, maybe when Grant comes back in, it might be the thing. Um, okay, I just seen your follow-up question as well. So we can, if there's a budget question, we might be able to take that offline with you, Naomi. But maybe there might be some high-level details, or even just some figures that we might be able to showcase. Okay, well, let's continue on just with the categories. So as Grant alluded to earlier on in the webinar, we've added some categories this year to the GTAs. It's probably something that we're going to look at every single year, because of the fact that the industry is moving so fast, and the lines are blurring all the time, and it's just evolving into such a big thing, that we wanted to try and recognize that this year, particularly with the categories. And Kieran Moore from Ogilvy reviewed the categories a number of years ago, which brought us to where we were at that point in time. And this year we really just tried to add to Kieran's foundations. So the list of categories should be in front of you there. They're all on the website as well. You can view them at any time. I mean, really, the first kind of 13 or so are kind of the standard industry ones. Some of the ones that we have introduced are the likes of content marketing, digital and social, technology from a product perspective, on a launch, a startup, experiential. And number 19 is an interesting one. It's the integrated marketing and communication campaign. So that's kind of as well just touching out on the periphery of the industry in terms of inclusive marketing and PR departments. So that's another interesting one for this year. Then towards the latter half of the list, we've always had a national campaign of the year, and we decided to bring in an international campaign of the year as well. So that's an Aussie-based campaign that's kind of done well on the international market. So that's another really interesting development. Those two categories you don't enter per se, so you don't enter in that category. It's actually picked from the GTA Executive Committee, which consists of Angela and Grant. So they actually review all the campaigns across the board, and then they choose what they feel is the most successful national and international campaign. Now, the next three categories is another new, I suppose, evolution of the GTAs this year. Previously, we have had a small or low cost pro bono category. And as Grant mentioned earlier on this morning, we wanted to make sure that budget and spend weren't an issue for an agency, no matter how big or small you are. So if you've got a huge budget of 100K plus, that's not going to guarantee that you're going to win. So we've split that up, and the split has actually been made according to our own registered consultancy group classification. So we have micro consultancy, which is 1 to 2 staff, so more sole traders. Medium consultancy is 3 to 9 staff, and then large consultancy is 10 or more staff. So that's the classifications for those three. So there are a number of consultancies in each of those brackets this year, so hopefully we'll have some good winners there. Number 25, in-house PR team of the year. That's the same as last year. Number 26, which is the top sprinter with a play on the letters P and R. So that's just to recognise the young guns in the industry. So it's 2 to 5 years experience. So the format of that actually stays the same. It's just a refresh of the name to give it more prominence. 27 is another new category. It's best individual transformation into the PR industry. So as we all know, journalists, advertisers, marketers, we're all kind of in a similar space in some respects. And we wanted to recognize that there are people now working in the PR industry that might not have come from a PR degree or a course in university. So that's a really interesting one. It's brand new. It will be, we're interested to see how many people we have going into that category. And because it's new and because it marks, I suppose, the evolution of the industry. So that's a really interesting one. 28 remains the same, which is the PR Educator of the Year. And the last one then is the President's Award. So really that's to recognise a serious industry contributor here in Australia. The award is actually conferred by our own PRIA National President. So again, that's not one that you can actually apply or nominate for. Our current president, which is Mike Watson, will be conferring over that particular award for someone who's made a big impact to the industry. Okay, I'll just stop there because we have a question from Michelle. Michelle says, micro, medium category. We have a multifaceted agency with 2 staff in PR and 1 other in another content generating field. Which category would we fit in? Grant, are you still there or?
Yeah, I'm back.
Oh, great. Oh, fantastic. So do you want to take that question?
Yeah, I mean, my advice would always be look at the work first rather than how much it costs or how many people you have. So if you've got a campaign, then enter that into a campaign category. For agency-specific categories, though, or if you've got 2 people in PR, I would say you've got a 2-person PR agency. And if you've got someone in content, but you're not using them as a practitioner of public relations, then they're effectively a supplier, would be the way that I would look at it. I mean, the registered consultancies group categories are on the basis of who actually pays for a consultancy membership, so that they're biased in some ways anyway. I don't think you're going to necessarily skew the results by entering into the micro consultancy category.
And just still on the micro consultancy, we have another question from Ashley. Does the 1 to 2 staff refer to the number of staff working on this campaign entry or the number of staff in the consultancy all up?
I'd look at that as the number of people in the consultancy all up.
Great. Okay, great. We've another question.
Otherwise, sorry, just to give a bit more detail on that. If we only looked at it on the basis of a campaign rather than on the basis of the performance of the business, which is what this is really recognizing, then you would find that some of the really high-end strategic programs that rely on senior staff doing a lot of the execution work would skew the ability of some of these micro consultancies to enter. So it's really about recognizing the work that the organization does rather than the individuals that make up the team.
Great. And the next question is just from Sophie, and this is a longer one. What if you wish to enter a category that doesn't exist? For example, we specialize in healthcare only. There is only one health organization category which really focuses on patient organization and government, but not pharmaceutical companies and the promotion of prescription medicines. Next year, will we finally introduce a prescriptions category that predominantly work with pharmaceutical companies, manufacture and market prescription medications?
Neil, you work for the PRA, so I'm probably going to throw a hospital pass back to you. But I think it really depends for the purpose of filling in an entry for this year, there are obviously restrictions on what you can do with pharmaceutical products. So I'd, take that with a grain of salt and say, which of the existing categories might something be best suited to, with the caveat that there are going to be restrictions on what precisely it is that you can do. So if you're trying to lobby government to get a particular prescription, to get a new drug onto the PBS, then you might want to look at a government relations piece or a public affairs piece to a category to see whether or not there are sufficient opportunities between the work that you've done and the criteria in those categories to give you a good chance. But in terms of whether or not a new category will be added next year, I think, Neil, you're probably much closer to that than I am.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it's open to conversation. As I mentioned earlier on, each year, who knows what we're going to be talking about next year. I mean, the last 12 months or so was around, content, and we tried to, identify that with content marketing. So who knows next year? So if this is open to anybody, if there is suggestions around categories, we of course will take them on board. I mean, the categories this year have come from a number of serious conversations from some of the senior industry players, from some of the agencies and in-house, plus our previous chair, Alison Lee, who did a fantastic job last year. And we'll be doing a full review again of the GTAs towards the tail end of the calendar year this year. So if anybody that's tuning in has something that, hasn't been on the agenda and you feel like that it could be, by all means, just, email gta@pria.com.au and we'll definitely take it on board. Now there's two other questions just read the transformation into the industry. And the question is just around the timing. So does the transformation have to have occurred over the past 12 months, i.e. should the individual have moved to PR within the past 12 months? And the second question is along that same train. All the GTA categories for this year are in the previous financial year. So anything from last June right up until this June, you can enter into the awards. So for the transition, it would be the same. And perhaps over time, we can look at maybe extending that out over a longer period. But for this year, we're going to stay with the financial year. And then there's a question from Shane, just in relation to the new category 27. Are you looking directly for someone who's transferred from a directly relevant field, i.e. advertising, etc., or from a more distinct field, i.e. technology consulting? Do you want to jump in there, Grant, or? Maybe we've lost Grant again. So no Wi-Fi down in Melbourne, maybe. No. Are you back?
No. Yeah, Mike Baird turned it off when he left the other day. No, I'm sorry, I just had the mute button on my new headset. Look, I think it's a good question coming from a marketing perspective to ask whether or not a particular field is more related. I think anyone in a public affairs or consultancy type public relations role would probably see other forms of consultancy to be, similarly like what they do. So I know from experience working with the guys at places like Deloitte or Ernst & Young. I mean, Ernst & Young have just released a report into profit shifting to say that more and more multinational companies need comms strategies to explain why they're not paying tax in the locations that they operate. Now, they're not typically a comms business, but they're selling a comms function. So, from a transition perspective, anyone coming into the PR industry is going to bring a different world of life experience with them. The things that we'd be looking for are their understanding of the application of the PR discipline and the goals of the discipline rather than what they've done previously. If we go back to first principles about what public relations is from a definition perspective, it's about relationships, and the way that we cultivate and build and nurture and leverage those relationships changes with the advent of more and different technologies over time. but you don't necessarily need to be trained in one or more of those technologies or one or more associated disciplines in order to be able to do PR well. You need to have an understanding of the principles, and you need to be able to work towards the end goal.
Great. And there's one final question maybe before we kick on again from Michelle, just in relation to the case studies. They're all in basic Word, Microsoft Word docs with no images. Can we include images and design as part of the submissions?
I think the ones that I've referenced today are in Word docs because we had to upload them to an external provider last year and it was text only. In the past we have had far more thorough design options for people. So look, I would include anything that helps you tell your story within the word count. And if you can, if one of your objectives was to get 20 members of parliament in a room with your client and you've got a photo of that, then absolutely bang it in. It becomes a great proof point for your copy, and it means that you don't have to burn as many words writing about it. So if you can design your entry in a way that makes it more digestible for the judges, that all of those things are only going to be positive.
Yeah, great. Okay. And yeah, Naomi, maybe read the budget and we might get Grant to touch base with you offline just about the confidential questions around that. Now, Grant, do you want to steer on ahead or do you want me to keep going?
Given my technical issues at this end, it might be safer if you continue on, Neil, and I can jump in if there's anything meaningful I can add.
Sure, sure. Okay, well, the next slide is just around the timeline. So this is all the information is available on the PRIA website under the Golden Targets drop down. And some of these timelines we've already kind of hit, so our chairs have been out there. I mean, the time-sensitive ones are really active now for the month of June. So early entries close on the 30th of June at 11:59 p.m. So to avoid a $70 late fee, which goes into July, I would suggest that everybody tries to get their entry in before then. The late entries then open from the 1st of July until the 15th. And then following the close of the late entries, the judges will then come together and deliberate over all the entries. And they've got about 2 weeks really to come to a conclusion. And then in August, we've actually introduced a new step this year to the process, which we haven't done before, where we're going to name the shortlist finalists. So in previous years, people would query whether, is it worth bringing 10 clients to a state final and then they come and then they're not recognized. So obviously, we can't tell anyone who has won beforehand. But what we're going to do this year is announce the short list. So that will give you a better idea that your entry is in with a chance of winning. And most of the states, depending on the entry numbers, will have a state finals then in August. And then the national finals will be in Hobart. Okay. Now, in terms of the terms and conditions, we've just highlighted a few of the kind of high-level ones here today. I mean, there's a whole list of them on the website, which you can refer to at any time. And some of the high-level ones here are, if you are going to enter into the GTA Awards, you must abide by the PRIA Code of Ethics. So that's part of your membership. Now, non-members, so people who aren't financial members of the PRIA, can enter, but part of the application fee is that you do need to sign up as a PRIA member. So it is open to non-members, but there is an increased cost there. So the question around, if you have multiple entries, yes, you can put them in different categories. So you might have a campaign, let's say example, Dumb Ways to Die, but it might fit in, consumer and somewhere else. You can actually enter it into a second category, but there is an additional fee. And then the other question around multiple entries is, if you have 2 entries from different clients, can you enter them into the same category? Yes, once they're from different clients and it's a different piece of work, yes, you can include them. But again, you will have to pay a separate fee. So a full list of the T's and C's is available on the site. The link is there. And just so everyone's aware, we are recording this webinar. So, if you want to listen to it afterwards, you can. We'll also share the slide deck as well, because I know there's some things here that have been hyperlinked, particularly Grant's case study. So don't worry, we'll share all this afterwards. The next point around the actual entry document process, as Grant said, this year it's simplified. We hope it's simplified that you can actually enter it in one PDF format. So everybody will have to submit an entry form, which is just the kind of finer details around your name, who the recipients of the award are, and so on. If the work has been done for a client, you'll need to sign the client authorization form. Then you submit the actual case study itself. And then you can also put in an extra 200 words around an executive summary on the company profile and so forth. And then the confidential budget can be sent separately, and that's kept very confidential. So they can all be uploaded as PDFs this year. And as Grant said, you can make your entry branded in your own, consultancy or company as much as you wish, but unless it really tells the story, people will not be, I suppose, disadvantaged if they just keep it as a very basic Word document. The other important note just around this year's process is when you go to actually hit the button to enter, you will be asked to actually pay for the award first, and then you'll go on to the next page, which is the entry process. Now we just have that set up that way because our system, is a little bit tricky, and it's not very user friendly in terms of dropping in and dropping out. So our advice is that only go to enter the awards when you've got everything ready to go. So you've got your entry form, you've got the case study, you've got the profile, the budget, and your credit card or invoices ready to go. And if you don't do that, it just becomes a little bit tricky for us to go in because the system sometimes recognizes two separate campaigns. So the pay cycle is at the very beginning. So just to make sure that everybody is 100% ready to go. The link is there if anybody needs it in terms of where you need to enter. If you've got any questions about the category, any issues like that, look, just don't feel free to contact Grant or Angela or even the national office at any moment, and we can answer it before you go and actually pay. In terms of some FAQs, I kind of already answered that one around being a non-member. Deadlines we've kind of gone through as well. They're not flexible, so the 15th of July is the last date that you can get it in. The last one around who receives the award. So in previous years we've had a person put their name on the entry, but then if it becomes successful, there might be a number of team members, or it might just be the actual consultancy as a team and that actually worked on that client or piece of business. So this year you can actually identify that it's the agency or organization or the individual themselves. So that's entirely up to you, and we've left that open on the entry form. So if it's been a team effort, you actually can mention that as well. May I enter the same work twice? Yep, you can. I mentioned that earlier on in the same category. Yes, you can do all that. And a full list of the FAQs are available on the website as well. So again, if you've got any queries, feel free to just email us at gta@pria.com.au. Now, most of the tips Grant has already gone through. I mean, we have an online bank of previous case studies to give you a flavour of kind of what's won in the past. Grant's mentioned the context instructions, following the instructions, outlining your target audience. I mean, it's all pretty standard stuff, avoid the cliches, tell the story, which you guys are all very used to, in your day to day. And the results part is very important. So even if you have got an absolutely amazing campaign, which has done very well in the industry, but if you haven't put in anything around the measurement or results part, you just won't get marked for it, and that will actually, affect your overall award. In terms of writing tips, again, it's all pretty standard in there. Again, we'll be sharing the slideshow so you can have a look at this afterwards. Grant has already gone through all the objectives, being clear about the opportunity and the context. And that's really it. Now, we have a couple of questions here just while I was kind of spurting on there. Is any weighing giving to early versus late entries, from Michelle? I can probably answer that one, Grant, or you can jump in over me if you're still there. I mean, no. To be honest, there's usually a late rush for entry. So the last week before the deadline is usually a pretty busy period. And even in the late period, we have a huge amount of entries that come in at that point as well. So the judges only begin to judge as at 15th of July, and they have no idea when the person has gone in, so there's no real issue there. But we obviously suggest that you get it done early so you avoid that late fee. Do I need to provide a video with my entry? Yes, as part of your entry, you can submit supporting media files. If you're going to support a video which helps tell your story, we suggest that you only submit one that's 45 seconds long. The reason for that is when we go to the national final stage, and if your award is successful, and you know, you can imagine the amount of awards that we have on the night. So if we've got a 5-minute video, we just won't be able to play it. We'll only be able to play 45 seconds. So if you can, you've got the bandwidth, please try and just submit a 45-second video. Otherwise, we'll just have to snip it off at 45 seconds. Do we need to add supporting documents, and are they judged? From Lee. Yeah, I mean, Grant, you might come in on top of me here, but I think, you know, if it aids to, you know, you telling your story as part of the entry, by all means, you know, add it into the Word doc. Would you agree, Grant? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think my advice on this, and similar to the use of video, is if you need additional stuff to tell your story, then you haven't done a good enough job in the way you're writing your entry. So anything that's additional should add value to the judge's experience of reviewing the submission that you've written. You shouldn't just drop 1,000 words of crap into a Word document, PDF it, and then upload a video that does all the work for you, because that's not helping anybody. And most judges do this kind of stuff outside of hours, so they may not necessarily have the time to go through large volumes of additional material. If you do have things that are relevant to the results that you generated, or that provide some form of illustration for the way that you did the work or the type of work that you did, if you did primary research that has a lot of depth and rigor to it and you want to show that to the judges, but you can only, you know, within the context of a word count, you can only kind of give a bit of a head check to, you know, 20 words that describe what that research was, then sure, go ahead, and judges will be able to, you know, use their professional experience to recognize what it is that they're reviewing.
Great. I think we have one final question from Sean. If you have team members across different states, can each of them enter into the same category?
Well, I don't know, Neil, would you charge them $350 for everyone that wanted to enter?
Well, I think it goes back to the original one, that if you've got a category, if it's been done by, if it's the same work, just replicated in different states. I mean, the awards are, or the entries are awarded from a national perspective and downwards, you know, so they're really, you know, recognized nationally first, and then it's fed back into the states. So for me, I mean, really, you should be thinking about that in the same lines, that if it's going in from it's a national, you know, awards, you know, campaign. So think about it that way.
Yeah, I think, you know, from my perspective, what I'd point to is whether or not the spread of the team somehow changes the work. So if you're doing a national local area marketing campaign, then you're going to be entering exactly the same thing a lot of times for no net gain, because the whole point of the exercise is local area marketing on a national level. If you were to look at something where the contribution in each state was somehow different, so for example, let's say you were doing government relations in New South Wales, but you were doing community engagement in Western Australia, then conceivably you might be able to break the work up into component parts and enter the different components. But, you know, to Neil's point, the golden target title is a national title, and then you have state winners in the respective categories. So you really need to look at what form of entry is going to, one, give you the best possible chance of taking home a golden target certificate and trophy at the end of the year, and two, what's going to deliver the best possible representation of the way the industry recognizes the work that your team has done.
Yeah. And I think just on that note as well, just for entries, I mean, the judging is done on a point system essentially, you know. So in order to be a winner, you have to have gotten past a certain mark. So what happens, you know, occasionally each year in the GTAs is that you might get a category, you know, it could be anything, health organizations, for example, and at a national level, there might not actually be a winner. And sometimes that causes a little bit of confusion because people say, oh, well, how come there hasn't been a winner in that category? Well, they're judged nationally, as we mentioned, by the judges. And if someone hasn't hit the certain marking rate for to get the national recognition, well, then there won't be a winner. And likewise, if you know a second award entry has gotten into the winning, you know, bracket, there might be actually two winners, or there could be three winners. So, just wanted to point that out because I know that can be quite confusing sometimes for people when they enter that, you know, there hasn't been a winner in that category, but that's how the marking system goes. And on that note, we've been delighted that we've had so many judges come on board this year. I think we're close to nearly 80 judges, which is phenomenal, considering that we really do need the addition of judges this year because we've added on those categories. So there will be a minimum of 3 judges per category, and each category will have a coordinator, and we'll be releasing the full judges list next week and who the coordinators are. So it'll be nice and transparent on the PRIA website. And then also feedback from all entries will be communicated to each of the entries after the national finals, which take place in Hobart on the 26th of October. So every entry will have some feedback, and that will be brought together by the coordinators, and we'll share it through the national office probably around November of this year. So if you've got any issues or anything you want to know, we'll have some feedback for you then.
And I think to that point, Neil, you know, there are 29 categories this year. That's a long time for people at a dinner to sit down and watch people come up and get trophies. So the judges have a vested interest in marking, you know, quite rigorously and making sure that only those entries that really do deserve to win a golden target actually do win a golden target. It's not that we need to have a winner in every category by any stretch of the imagination. We want to make sure we're celebrating the absolute best practice work in the industry, and that means that we actually have to put a really stringent set of standards around the way that we recognize that work.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think that kind of concludes the webinar. Sorry, we kind of moved on into a little bit extra in terms of time, so it's just 8 minutes past 1. So apologies for that, and I know it's a Friday as well. So I'll wrap this up pretty quickly. Just one final plug from a PRA perspective. Our next webinar is on social media strategy from Icentia, and that's going to be on the 10th of July. I think we might have a change of presenter. I think it might actually be Richard Spencer, who I'm sure most people tuning in will know Richard, and they've been a big supporter of the PRA in the last few years. So that webinar is on 10th July. You can register right now on the PRA website. And then the minute you close off from this webinar, you'll just be asked to shoot back some feedback very quickly. So if you've got any suggestions on a webinar that we should be hosting, feel free to just email us in. And that's it. Thank you so much, Grant.
Oh, thanks for having me. And as Neil said, if anyone has any specific questions that they want to ping through to me, feel free to.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great weekend. See you.